as sad as the continued demise of the Korean StarCraft 2 scene has been, particularly with Pro League obviously shutting down and then so many of the big Kesper teams gradually shedding their rosters, and now we're in a situation where so many Korean players play for small or foreign orgs. One thing that seems to have reignited StarCraft as a franchise and given kind of some level of hope to Western fans particularly has been the increase of the Brood War scene, which is very much a grassroots scene and has been revitalized. And now, obviously, with ASL, it even has more prestige attached to it. And now there's rumblings maybe Blizzard will make a HD version of StarCraft Brood War, since obviously it's a very old game. I think it's even like isometric or something, the way the graphics are portrayed. And it's at the status now where maybe something like OGN would get involved and do a proper OSL again. I mean, it certainly seems like the numbers and kind of the hype around it is approaching that level. So one of the big issues here is not just the quality of the players who are playing, but the numbers are big. I mean, when Flash played Jaedong in the semi-final of the ASL, there were 22,000 viewers on Twitch. There, supposedly, the numbers reported was 200,000 overall across all streams, including Africa and Korea and presumably China as well, since there is still a Chinese scene. In fact, actually, Bisu and some of them have been over to some smaller events over there. Savior has, in fact, as well. So if you look at Twitter, the esports industry has been abuzz with people who are hyped about it, who are watching it, who seem to have a renewed interest in the game. People, including Toasis and Tasteless, were posting pictures of the crowd inside the little stadium, and this was much bigger than you get for even a lot of the GSL games up until the final. Like this was a pretty decent sized crowd. It was nothing compared to like obviously something like League of Legends or CS:GO, and where they're in big stadiums, but this was a pretty sizable amount of people. The stadium was packed pretty much, and so all of this grows to make it feel like, wow, is StarCraft Brood War's getting bigger again? Can it ever get big? The problem is, Brood War as a game did not just get revitalized now in 2017. It did not just start getting big again at the end of 2016. Brood War as a game has always remained popular as a casual game in South Korea. I mean, even during the days when StarCraft 2 as an esport was in its heyday around the whole world, StarCraft Brood War was still above it in the rankings of the games played in PC banks. Like, you could go in there and it would still be top 10, or it would still be multiple places above StarCraft 2. Which, interestingly enough, was enabled on all the PCs, and people, if they wanted to, could have played StarCraft 2, but they didn't. They chose to play Brood War instead. So even before Sonic brought out his Sonic TV Star Leagues, and those started up, and the old pros came back from StarCraft 2, I mean, there already was a game that continued to be popular. Now, the esports side of thing, yeah, really did kind of return around 2015. Like around, by the way, every year, the Sonic Star Leagues have been running back years and years, like 3 or 4 years back we're going. But the difference is, they had the tier 2 and the tier 3 level ex-Kesper pros there, or the pros that didn't switch over, or the pros that came back from the army, or the pros that were tier 3 or tier 2 in Brood War, but then when StarCraft 2 came about, never made the grade, never made the cut, never made it deep into GSLs, never made it to Code S, and therefore retired, therefore went back to life in Brood War, therefore just chose to play Brood War because they thought it was a more fun game. The big thing was, obviously, 2015 was the year when now you had Bisu playing again. Now you had one of the all-time great players play again. Then you had the rumblings of more and more players coming over. Jangbi, when he retired from StarCraft 2, came over briefly. You had some of the decent enough pros who had been very good in Brood War who came back. And now, now in 2016, going into 2017, now there's a massive amount of talent. I mean, there already was talent before. Yeah, there was Bisu. There was Hero, who always was one of the guys with the best APM, one of the best Zergs, was in a bunch of Sonic Star League finals, won one of them over Bisu. There was Mind, a former MSL champion, someone who once upon a time was actually considered a potential prodigy, a young talent who won at like 15 or something, who people looked at like, maybe it's going to be him, Flash, Fantasy. These are the next great Terrans. He never quite lived up to that destiny. He had some good individual league performances, but never became that superstar. You obviously had Effort returning. It didn't really work out that well for him in StarCraft 2. Had been himself a prodigious talent, someone very, very skilled in StarCraft Brood War, even though actually, interestingly enough, in individual leagues, didn't actually have that great a run of form beyond the famous Korean era OSL where he upset Flash. Now, yeah, we understand now Take Bang Lee Sang, Jaedong, Flash, Stork, Bisu, they're all back in the game, but there already were tons of ex-pros. That's the key thing. It wasn't just that these great players came back and now we're just watching for the nostalgia. The baseline, the grassroots element of like really good pros and then even better pros than them and then the next pros were really all there. You had all these talented players. I mean, you look at some of the ASL and SSL groups, and this could have been an OSL in 2012. This could have been an OSL in 2011. This is a really high level of talent playing the game. But, and in fact, here's the other thing. Yeah, a lot of people don't know this because they hadn't followed Brood War, how it had been going over the last couple of years, but it already had big crowds. I went to one of the Sonic Star League finals, the one I'm talking about where Hero upset Bisu. They had a pretty big crowd. They had thousands of people there. It was held in the same arena, in fact, as they held an LCK final, the League of Legends in Korea final, which was obviously like a massive esports event. And when I was there, yeah, it was a big crowd, and it was a production that was like an OSL production. In fact, that's actually where there's a GIF that people sometimes post of me sat with what was at the time my girlfriend, where when the camera comes on me, because they always put it on like the white people in the audience just to show, oh look, foreigners are interested in Brood War and Korean esports. When they put the camera on me, it's one where I did like a throat slash, and the crowd loved it, whatever. I mean, you couldn't actually hear it on the GIF, obviously, but just the people around like, oh yeah, because they thought I was like into esports or some shit, which I guess I am, sort of. So there already were these big crowds for a few of those Sonic Star Leagues. But the difference is, what has made it a phenomenon is that now we have the greatest players back. And the difference is the greatest players who actually could still play at a big level. Like, to me, it's not really that exciting to, if you tell me, oh, I'm going to do a little exhibition tournament with Boxer and Yellow and I mean, obviously you can't have like Saviour. Oh, and then we'll have Nada as well. They're going to play. Who gives a shit? Like, half the players you just mentioned there have not been relevant as actual in the server players for a decade or more. So don't really care about that. Difference is, you tell me Bisu and Jaedong and stuff have come back. I've seen these guys play online. I've seen these guys stream. I've seen these guys play. They're still some of the best Brood War players in the world. They're still some of the best esports competitors in the world in terms of what they can do within that game, which obviously they didn't need as much time to get back up to speed on because they're some of the all-time legendary greats. So yeah, the key differences now are that the latter-day gods are back. I mean, pretty much the only one who isn't really back is Fantasy, because he's still somehow hanging around StarCraft 2, the dregs of that, which is a shame. Obviously, Jangbi like retired and then came along, but hasn't really like fully dedicated himself to it. That's a shame in its own sense. But you got all this other talent from Brood War. Really, if we're being honest, the revival and the hype that people are talking about now isn't Brood War having tournaments again, Brood War having big crowds again, Brood War having really good players again and really good matches again. People, a lot of the Westerners didn't really care about Brood War even when all that was going on. They maybe knew about it and thought, oh, that's cool or whatever, but they didn't follow it, they didn't watch the games. If we're being real, what's making people watch these games is that Flash and Jaedong are back. And a lot of people who didn't watch Brood War or who barely watched Brood War know that these are legendary figures. They know sort of the legend of them, but they only watched them in StarCraft 2. And the worst thing is in StarCraft 2, sure, Jaedong was very good at one point in time, but in general, in StarCraft 2, those players are not even close to what they were in Brood War. So I feel like the fact that people know that they're legendary players and they wanted to get hyped about them in StarCraft 2, like the hype surrounding Flash every time he made Code S around 16 was unreal. But that's it. He never made it further. He never made those deep runs. Jaedong, yeah, he had some pretty cool games where he did look like he had killer instinct and was decisive in StarCraft 2, but he wasn't that god who just dominated above everyone else and could make 4 finals in a year like he was in Brood War. So I feel like that's part of the reason why now people are getting super hyped, because now they're following these players back, and now this is a game where these players are gods, and they can finally get into the hype of it. And so I do have a minor issue with that. Like, listen, it's fine for people to get hyped, but I do find it a bit feckless when people are like, I'm the biggest Jaedong fan ever. Oh, you know, Flash is the best pro gamer of all time. And they've either never watched Brood War competitively, or they say that and have been saying that for years, and now are watching Brood War because it's a live game, but wouldn't, for example, just go back and watch some of the classic games. I mean, we're not talking about going back and watching 500 VODs. If you're the biggest fan of Flash ever, go back and watch the finals he was in. He was only in like 8. We're not asking you to watch much. If you think Jaedong's amazing, which he is, by the way, go watch a Jaedong ZVP from anywhere from like 2008 to 2011. The guy was unbeatable. He took on all the best. He always found a way to beat them. He had the insane killer instinct, and it didn't matter where the meta was in the matchup, he could always win. You'd have a lot of fun watching these games, and they're all out there on YouTube available. Most of them even cast in English if you go and look still. So I actually think a final key as to why people really have gotten back into the scene is also because the casters. Because before that, we had people who were good, but they were community people. They were people who were just putting in the effort. They didn't have the name. The real key thing that's gotten people hyped is that Tasteless Nartosis are casted in the game. Now, here's another detail people will not know, actually. There's a piece of trivia. Tasteless Nartosis are not a casting duo from Brood War. As in, yeah, they've cast WCGs before, towards the very end. They have never cast, like, an OSL or an MSL in English. Tasteless was a caster. He came over and did the GOM League, which is the third league at the time, outside of OSM and MSL, and had all the top players in it. But Artosis was not a caster at the time. He was someone who only became this big caster in StarCraft 2. So, yeah, it is cool to have that duo come over. And, yeah, they are fantastic. I mean, they go a little bit too ham on the nostalgia sometimes, but in general, they're up to speed on it. In fact, actually, here's an interesting detail. Tasteless, absolutely, for all the jokes about lost his passion, there's something to that in StarCraft 2, because he's on point in Brood War. He's been studying the meta. He knows what the latest builds are. He understands the metagame and stuff. He can now comment quite insightfully and incisively on the actual game as it's going on. And now it's like we've got this fantastic duo where it feels like you got two hybrid colour commentators who are going back and forth and a great rapport. It's fantastic. They're actually better at Brood War, I think, than they were in StarCraft 2, just because the nature of the game and the nature of where Tasteless seemed to be in his career as a pro. And I felt like Artosis had to carry the knowledge burden a lot more in that game, for whatever reason. But in Brood War, yeah, they are back, and yeah, they are bringing excitement. This is fantastic. The problem I have with the Brood War revival is Brood War is one of my favourite games. I love watching these games right now in ASL, but the problem I have is it's cool on its own level and in its own very specific set of circumstances, in its own context. It will never be the same as when Brood War was the number one game in Korean esports. I mean, the lack of a team house structure means that you don't have the same kind of practice partners, and you don't have the same coaching of you, and you don't have people arranging for special practice partners who then mimic your opponent, and all these things that made the game so intense and so great, and knowing that all the top players were playing at least 12 hours a day, and therefore they were at their max possible level. It's also crucially, and this is the biggest problem that Brood War has and why it'll never be at that superstar level again, it seems, there's no pro league. Now, what a lot of people never understood in the West, because of how different StarCraft 2 was in an esports game compared to Brood War, is that Pro League was the backbone, it was the lifeblood of Korean Brood War. Yes, if you're a Westerner, you mainly cared about OSL and MSL and who was the best individual player and who was the champion and what was the most epic match. Yeah, that's all the case. But it was the weekly Pro League matches, which spanned most of the year, which allowed teams to figure out their practice and to keep everyone in form and to have this player practicing certain matchups and be able to see week to week what level someone's at and what maps they're good at. And then you take that into the individual leagues and then you have the best players battle it out and see who the ultimate player is. But then in this Pro League match, you can have a guy who'd never even get to the playoffs, who could never even probably qualify for a Star League. But he's a specific sniper who snipes off Zerg players and he preps for Jaedong and he preps on that map and he comes with something interesting. Maybe he can pick Jaedong off because Jaedong isn't going to have studied that guy, whereas now he has studied all the VODs from that guy. So that was the lifeblood. That was how the industry ran in Korean Brood War. And that's how you always had that consistent practice that was at a top level. In fact, interestingly enough, it's only once you got deep in a pro league, in a star league, like if you got to the semis of the OSL or MSL, that's when your coach might start giving you time off your practice for pro league to focus on trying to win that individual league. I mean, this is why famously, when Jelizerg was in SK Telecom in like 2007, 2008 sort of period of time, they were actually quite upset that he didn't do much in pro league and wasn't able to contribute to the team, but managed to win an OSL. Like, that wasn't great for them that he just won this OSL and then contributed fuck all elsewhere and declined as a player. They hired him to be a star in Pro League. You know, that's what they wanted, to revitalize the SK Telecom name, which obviously would happen later, but with Bisu and Fantasy, not with Jelizerg, actually. And so people can't really understand that because StarCraft 2 was all about the 1v1 aspect of the game. There never was a proper Pro League in the same way. Obviously, there was in Korea, but it only really got rolling and really got like to be a big part of the game by the time the Kesper teams came over. And that was kind of too late already to ever be the number one league. Yeah, you had, obviously, those other team leagues before that, but that wasn't as big a deal. That was not a massive deal. They were always secondary to the GSL, etc. GSL was the number one league, and because Western fans were watching Western competitions, which were 1v1, this was the nature of tournaments. It was about being a good 1v1 player, and that's how you made your money, and that's why you joined teams. But as a result, teams weren't as necessary in Korean StarCraft 2. It wasn't as big a deal, whereas that was a massive deal within StarCraft Brood War. Also, you've got to add in that the prestige is not the same. I mean, one of the big problems that the revival has is that there isn't enough new blood. even the players who are rising up again and doing a bit better than they might have done before, yeah, they're players who were around in Brood War, though, or who were around at the very end of Brood War going into StarCraft 2. There's not really those fresh, like, 15, 16-year-olds who are going to be the next Jadongs and Flashes, and they just need their time and the right team house, and the right practice environment, the right Pro League matches to blood them in, and then they qualify for an OSL. They're not there, unfortunately. So it's really cool, but it has kind of a clock on it, and it has kind of a limit, and the limit is basically how long these great players can play great matches for, and we can all stay interested watching them. As a result, it doesn't really matter to some degree, aside from within itself, the fact it's aesthetically pleasing and fun, if you win an ASL. I mean, Jadong could win 7 ASLs, and that won't make him overtake Flash as the best Brood War player of all time, despite the fact how close it was between the two of them. I mean, remember, the GOM League was there as a third league, and it was a very legit league, and it had some great games in it and great competitions. It was only really like the third season that was unfortunately flawed by some of the teams not taking part. But regardless of that, we were still in a situation where even if you won that league, when it died off, no one talks about that anymore. They just talk about how many OSLs and MSLs you won. I mean, to me, World Cyber Games was never that big a deal, because obviously you could only have like 3 Koreans there in general. World Cyber Games was only mattered to Koreans because of the nationalism. They wanted to prove that Korea is the best, and they did. They always won every single World Cyber Games. So that's the only reason it mattered to them. It was a different aspect. It was representing your country at that point in time. So here's the thing. I think the Brood War Revival is really cool. I mean, I am someone who spent the last few years, I wasn't away and I wasn't just watching StarCraft 2. I have, ever since I got really into Brood War at the end of 2009, every year I've been watching this game. I go back and I watch the old runs, watch Flash's run through the Bacchus OSL where he beats all the best players in the world, all the other greats. I go back and I watch like classic Game 7 Pro League matches where Bisu played Jadong. There were a whole bunch of them, ace matches, where they were amazing matches, and Bisu actually tended to get the better of them in those ones. I love to go watch these matches. I love to watch actually great stream games that they have now, where you get to see, I mean, what's interesting is you get these FPOVs where they'll put both of them side by side, and you can watch both amazing players play at once. Like, go watch some of the Bisu vs. Effort ones like that. They're unreal to see how skilled they are, and to watch both of them trying to figure out the time with Fog of War on, what the other one's doing. It's absolutely fascinating to watch if you know about the game. With that said, though, this does add a new element of excitement. Obviously, this is a lot more fun to have Flash and Jadong back as well, two of the really great players, and they seem to be into the game, even though they can't be in the same way as when the scene was huge and had 300k salaries and team houses, etc. So this is still really cool to watch. It's certainly interesting to see how the metagame has evolved. One of the things I love about Brood War, and this applies to Counter-Strike 1.6, and this applies to Quake Live, it doesn't matter how long these games have been played. Those games could be played for 30 years, and because there are enough tools within the game, and enough good maps, and enough fantastic players of different skill sets, and they allow for different skill sets, there will always be an evolving metagame that changes, and things that are overpowered and become no longer overpowered when counters are found, because there's so much depth and room in the game, so much width of opportunity and then depth of possibility within each of those, and so many tools for great players to use to craft their art. The game is their canvas upon which they show us the art of playing a game as good as Brood War. Incredibly difficult, but incredibly strategically deep game as well. And it's quite clear, I mean, forget that whole argument that the StarCraft 2 fans wanted to keep going and perpetuate and put excuses for, like, if you give StarCraft 2 6 years, then it'll get as deep and as good. It hasn't, and it hasn't worked out, and it has never gotten to that level, and Brood War is still a better game now, years afterwards, without the same sort of money pumped into it and propped up as StarCraft 2 had for the last few years. So I think it's awesome to watch. It is still, just even in terms of aesthetics and excitement, a fantastic game to watch. It is really good. For all the people who complain about, the graphics aren't good, the graphics are better than StarCraft 2's. Now, they aren't in as much as the quality of the graphics are not as good, the imaging, the way the animations are done, but actually it is easier to see. So for me, in my sense that I like graphics, the graphics are better in Brood War. I can see everything that's happening, every unit that's doing something. It's all very, very clear to me, actually. Whereas in StarCraft 2, it's not. It is big death balls, and it is blurs and lasers shooting everything, and it can be quite difficult to see what's going on in terms of every single little detail. And obviously, micro is not as important in that game anyway. There's not as much individual micro of one unit or 2 units in a small control group here or there, like you would get with vultures or muters or whatever. So I think it's awesome. I do find it a little bit bizarre that they don't put production tabs on. I mean, I've heard apparently that's because the Koreans don't need it and they don't like it, Sarah. But that is a bit weird, because actually the OSLs at Sarah always had them on. And so it meant that for the most casual pleb viewer, it's going to be a lot easier for them to have a sense of who's behind and then who's catching up, and then if the Zerg's macroing well and hatching all his lava. Like, in that sense, I think that actually might help a little bit. One thing I will say about Brood War as a game, from being able to watch Flash and Jadong play again especially, is that one thing that I don't think any RTS will ever be able to match with Brood War is the pacing is unparalleled in the game. It's the only RTS I've ever seen where it has everything you'd want, the full gamut. It has those great little cheeses. It has those great timing pushes from 10 minutes to 15 minutes. And then it also has those macro games. And what's great about a macro game in Brood War is that in StarCraft 2, the macro happened way too quick. You got up to the 200 army, you smashed it into each other. The one that lost by enough had to hurriedly try and get all of his army back. Otherwise, he lost the game instantly. You only get those one or two really big fights in general. And that's it. Whereas what happens is a great macro game in Brood War is like these chapters unfolding. Like, oh, it's chapter 1. Can the other guy survive a little bit? He did. Now he gets into the next part. Now he'll have an advantage in 5 minutes if he can hold on. He goes up to this next part. And as they expand out and they're 3-4 bases and the game's going 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour long, you really get to see this proper chess match. It's really, really intense but exciting, and it's not boring, the fact it's drawn out. In games like League of Legends, in games like Counter-Strike, sometimes when it gets really, really drawn out, like too many overtimes in Counter-Strike, like an hour, 10-minute game in League of Legends, the game actually degrades. It's not as good a game. People tend to go to shit. When you get an amazing macro game in Brood War, this is people at their absolute peak still. This is some of the best plays, and now it gets even harder to decisively win the game, and it's fantastic to watch. So the Brood War revival is pretty cool. There's some great aspects to it, but I think if you put it in context, it's maybe being a little bit overhyped, or people are just being a little bit too optimistic, or a little bit kind of daydreamish and pipe dreamish in thinking that it's going to become some full revival of the scene back to like 2008, which it clearly isn't.